November 9th, 1965, 5:28 p.m., Northeast Power Grid, United States and Canada. The temperature drops to 32 degrees Fahrenheit as the sun sets over Lake Ontario. Inside the Sir Adam Beck Generating Station No. 2 in Queenston, Ontario, Supervisor Robert Bannerman watches the panel gauges with the concentration of a surgeon. The hum of the 5 massive generators vibrates through the concrete floor, through his boots, up into his chest. He has worked this board for 11 years. He knows every sound, every harmonic frequency, every subtle variation in the mechanical symphony that keeps the lights burning from Toronto to New York City. At 5:16 p.m., relay Q29BD clicked off. Routine. A protective relay sensing an overload on the transmission line to the Niagara Mohawk Power Corporation grid. The system compensated automatically, rerouting 300 megawatts through parallel lines. Bannerman logged it. At 5:22 p.m., relay Q29BE clicked off. Less routine. The backup relay shouldn't trip unless something downstream is wrong. Bannerman reaches for the telephone to call the dispatcher in Syracuse. Before his hand touches the receiver, the lights flicker. Not the station lights. Those run on isolated circuits. But through the windows overlooking the gorge, he sees the glow from the tourist restaurants along the Canadian side of Niagara Falls, pulse like a failing heartbeat. Once, twice, then steady again. Bannerman's hand hovers above the phone. In the reflection of the darkened control panel glass, he sees his own face, suddenly older, uncertain. The hum changes pitch, drops a quarter tone. The kind of change that means somewhere in the massive interconnected web of power lines stretching across 8 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces, something fundamental has broken. His hand closes on the phone. But before he can lift the receiver, every light in the station goes dark. The generators don't wind down gradually. They don't slow with the groaning mechanical death that every operator has been trained to expect. They simply stop. 5 generators producing 1,824 megawatts of electricity, machines weighing hundreds of tons spinning at 3,600 revolutions per minute, cease rotating as if a giant invisible hand has grabbed them. In the silence that follows, Bannerman hears his own breathing. He hears the wind off Lake Ontario rattling the window frames. He hears, very faintly, car horns beginning to sound in the distance. He doesn't yet know that in the next 17 minutes, 30 million people will be sitting in the dark. He doesn't know that 800,000 people will be trapped in subway cars beneath Manhattan. He doesn't know that pregnant women will give birth by flashlight, that patients on iron lungs will survive only because nurses manually pumped their respirators, that looters will smash windows along 125th Street while police officers direct traffic with flashlights gripped in frozen hands. He doesn't know that in a small apartment in Greenwich Village, a man named Alexander Sokolov will make a terrible mistake. And he certainly doesn't know that this mistake will unravel a Soviet intelligence operation that has been running successfully in the United States for 16 years. The official story forms quickly, constructed in the hours and days following what newspapers will call the Great Blackout of 1965. Investigators from the Federal Power Commission arrive at the Beck station before dawn on November 10th, their breath forming clouds in the unheated control room. They examine relay Q29BD, a small mechanical device about the size of a briefcase, manufactured by Ontario Hydro's Equipment Division in 1963. The relay's job is simple. If too much current flows through transmission line 2L22, the relay trips, disconnecting the line before the wire overheats and sags into trees or buildings. The relay trips at 375 megawatts. The line is rated for 300 megawatts normal operation, except that at 5:16 p.m. on November 9th, 1965, the relay was somehow set to trip at only 275 megawatts. Nobody can explain why. A maintenance error, perhaps. A manufacturing defect. The official report, published in December 1965, concludes that relay Q29BD malfunctioned, creating a cascade failure across the interconnected grid. Power surged from the Beck station into New York, overloading transmission lines, tripping more relays, forcing power to find new paths, overloading those paths, tripping those relays in an accelerating domino effect that lasted just under 12 seconds. 12 seconds to plunge 30 million people into darkness. The Federal Power Commission recommends better relay coordination, improved communication between utilities, more robust circuit breakers. Northeast utilities spend $200 million upgrading equipment. Engineers write papers about cascade failure modes and grid stability. Within a year, the Great Blackout becomes a case study in electrical engineering textbooks, a cautionary tale about interconnected systems and single points of failure. President Lyndon Johnson receives briefings. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara wants to know if Soviet sabotage could have caused the blackout. The CIA and FBI investigate, find nothing suspicious, report back that relay Q29BD simply failed. McNamara files the reports. The investigation closes. Everyone misses the real story, because the real story doesn't start at the Beck generating station in Ontario. It starts 6,000 miles away, in a drab office building in Moscow's Yasenevo district, where a KGB colonel named Yuri Nosenko runs Directorate S, responsible for illegal intelligence operations in North America. And it starts with a seemingly unrelated question. How do you coordinate a network of deep cover spies who cannot communicate with each other or with Moscow without risking exposure? The answer, developed over years of painstaking operational planning, is elegant in its simplicity. You use number stations. Anyone with a shortwave radio in the 1960s knows the number stations, though few understand what they are. They broadcast from powerful transmitters in Cuba, Mexico, East Germany, and the Soviet Union itself. The broadcasts follow an identical pattern: a woman's voice, flat and mechanical, reciting strings of numbers in Spanish, Russian, German, or English. Atención, atención, tres, nueve, siete, dos, cuatro. The numbers continue for several minutes. Then the broadcast ends. No identification, no explanation. Just numbers read by a woman who might be a recording, who might be sitting in a concrete bunker somewhere reading from a codebook, who might be an automaton for all the emotion in her voice. Intelligence agencies know these stations are communication channels for illegal agents, spies operating without diplomatic cover, using false identities, impossible to detect through normal counterintelligence. The numbers are enciphered messages, one-time pad codes, theoretically unbreakable if the encryption is properly implemented. But knowing numbers stations exist and actually catching the spies who listen to them are different problems entirely. By November 1965, the FBI Counterintelligence Division estimates that at least 15 Soviet illegals are operating somewhere in the United States. They have names, probably false. They have jobs, probably legitimate cover occupations. They meet with American sources, photograph documents, pass intelligence back to Moscow through courier systems or dead drops. And they listen to number stations, probably on specific nights, at specific times, for the encoded messages that tell them what Moscow wants. But which 15 Americans, among 194 million citizens, are the illegals? The FBI has been trying to answer this question since 1945. They run surveillance on suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover at the United Nations and the Soviet Embassy in Washington, hoping these officers will lead them to their illegal agents. Sometimes it works. In September 1957, FBI surveillance teams follow KGB officer Rudolf Abel's courier to a storage locker in Brooklyn, leading to Abel's arrest. But Abel is one illegal among dozens, perhaps hundreds, operating successfully throughout the Cold War. The FBI tries technical approaches. They monitor numbers station broadcasts, recording every transmission, filing thousands of hours of tape that analysts pore over, searching for patterns. They build statistical models showing when broadcasts occur, how long they last, what frequencies are used. They learn that station UVB76, broadcasting from near Moscow, transmits on 4625 kHz every day at 0300 GMT. They learn that Atención stations in Cuba broadcast Tuesday and Thursday evenings. They learn that stations use call signs like Nancy Adams Susan, or numbers like V07, or musical signatures like the opening bars of the Lincolnshire Poacher. But they cannot break the codes. And even if they could, they cannot identify who is listening. The problem is power. In 1965, shortwave receivers are common. Millions of Americans own them. Radio hobbyists, amateur radio operators, people who enjoy listening to international broadcasts from the BBC or Radio Moscow or Voice of America, all of them own shortwave receivers capable of tuning to the same frequencies the number stations use. How do you distinguish a Soviet illegal listening to 4625 kHz from a teenage boy in Cleveland listening to the same frequency out of curiosity? You can't, unless something forces the illegals to reveal themselves. Something like a complete electrical blackout across the northeastern United States. Alexander Sokolov lives at 47 Grove Street in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, in a fourth-floor walk-up apartment with a window overlooking a small courtyard where pigeons gather near a broken fountain. He is 42 years old. He teaches Russian literature at New York University, 2 subway stops south on the IRT. His colleagues consider him scholarly, somewhat shy, more comfortable with Dostoevsky than with departmental politics. His students remember him as the professor who insisted they read Crime and Punishment in the original Russian if they wanted to understand Raskolnikov's psychology, who could recite passages from The Brothers Karamazov from memory, who sometimes stood at the window during office hours, staring at Washington Square Park with an expression his teaching assistant once described as sad, like he's remembering something painful. His real name is Alexei Borisovich Yakovlev. He is a major in the KGB's first chief directorate, Directorate S, graduated from the Andropov Institute in 1948, trained in deep cover operations, infiltrated into the United States in 1949, using documentation that identifies him as a Polish immigrant who survived the war in a displaced persons camp in Austria. His legend, his false biography, includes details about a mother who died of typhus in Outage, a father executed by the Nazis in 1942, 2 sisters lost somewhere in the chaos of the Eastern Front. It is a story designed to explain why Alexander Sokolov has no family, no connections, nothing that ties him to any verifiable past. For 16 years, he has lived this legend. For 16 years, he has taught at NYU, publishing occasional papers on Tolstoy and Turgenev, attending faculty meetings, grading papers, maintaining the fiction of a life devoted to literature. And for 16 years, he has collected intelligence from a source whose identity even he doesn't know. A source who leaves photographed documents in a dead drop in Central Park. Documents that Sokolov retrieves and passes to a courier who meets him monthly near the chess tables in Washington Square Park. The documents concern something called Project Dinosaur, a U.S. Air Force program to develop a manned orbital spacecraft that can maneuver during re-entry, essentially a space bomber, capable of hitting any target on Earth within one orbit. The documents include technical specifications for the spacecraft's delta wing design, heat shield composition, orbital maneuvering fuel calculations. Moscow considers dinosaur intelligence a top priority. The courier who meets Sokolov, a man Sokolov knows only as Peter, probably another illegal, carries the photographed documents to Mexico City every month, where they pass through the Soviet embassy's diplomatic pouch to Moscow. Sokolov receives his instructions through number station broadcasts. Every Tuesday evening at 9 p.m., he tunes his Hallicrafter's SX-122 shortwave receiver to 58850 kHz and listens to station UVB-76's secondary broadcast. If the broadcast begins with the number sequence 7 to 39, he knows a message follows for him. He writes down the subsequent numbers, usually 30 to 40 groups of 5 digits each, and decodes them using a one-time pad hidden inside the binding of his personal copy of War and Peace, the 1942 Maud translation, sitting on the shelf above his desk. The decoded messages are brief. Continue current meeting schedule. Or, source documents satisfactory. Priority remains booster specifications. Or, suspend contact 14 days. Resume normal schedule thereafter. On November 9th, 1965, Sokolov expects no message. The previous Tuesday's broadcast contained no 739 sequence. But he tunes to 5850 kHz anyway, at exactly 9 p.m., because the protocols drilled into him during his training at the Andropov Institute 17 years ago demand consistency. You maintain your schedule. You follow procedures. You never deviate unless the message explicitly instructs deviation. At 5:28 p.m., 92 minutes before he plans to check the broadcast, every light in his apartment goes dark. Sokolov is reading a student paper on Gogol's Dead Souls, sitting in the armchair near the window where the daylight lasts longest. When the lights fail, he looks up, mildly annoyed. The apartment building is old. Circuit breakers trip occasionally. He stands, intending to check the breaker box in the kitchen. Then he notices the streetlights are dark. The buildings across the courtyard are dark. Through the window, looking south toward Houston Street, he sees every window black, every streetlight dead. Even the traffic signals are out. He can see the intersection at 7th Avenue, where cars are already honking, drivers confused by the sudden absence of red and green. Sokolov's training reasserts itself immediately. His mind catalogs possibilities. Local power outage, unlikely, given the geographic extent of the darkness. Transformer failure, possible, but would affect a smaller area. Sabotage, possible, and if so, possibly related to his operation. He moves to his closet, retrieves the Hallicrafter's receiver, carries it to his desk. The receiver runs on standard 120-volt household current. It will not function without electricity. He owns a battery-powered portable receiver, a small Zenith transoceanic he keeps in the bedroom closet for emergencies. He retrieves it, extends the telescoping antenna, tunes to 5850 kHz. The receiver's dial glows faintly in the darkness. At 9 p.m., he will listen to the scheduled broadcast, even though he expects nothing. This is his first mistake. Because he doesn't consider that Moscow might also be monitoring the blackout, that KGB officers in the Yasenevo Operations Center might be watching news reports on the Reuters wire service, might be seeing photographs of Manhattan's skyline completely dark, might be deciding that this unprecedented event requires an emergency broadcast to all illegals in the affected area. The broadcast begins at 8:47 p.m., 13 minutes early. Sokolov isn't listening yet. He's standing at the window, watching people in the street below, lighting candles, seeing the flicker of flashlights, hearing the growing sound of confusion and concern rising from the sidewalks. The city sounds different in the darkness. More voices, more movement, an edge of anxiety that wasn't there before. At 8:59 p.m., he returns to his desk, switches on the Zenith receiver, tunes to 5850 kHz. The broadcast is already in progress. A woman's voice, speaking Russian, reading numbers. Try, Shest, Vozum, Odin, Diva, Try, Devyat, Chatir, Sem, Nol. He grabs paper and pencil, begins transcribing, but the broadcast is ending. He catches only the final 12 number groups before the transmission stops. 12 groups. Not enough to decode properly. The one-time pad system requires both sender and receiver to begin at the same position in the pad. If he missed the beginning of the broadcast, he cannot decode the ending. The numbers are meaningless. Sokolov stares at the paper. His hand, gripping the pencil, is trembling slightly. In 16 years of operation, He has never missed a broadcast sequence. The protocols are clear. If you miss a broadcast, you wait for the next scheduled transmission. You do not deviate. You do not improvise. But station UVB-76's secondary broadcast runs only on Tuesdays at 9:06 p.m. The next scheduled broadcast is 7 days away. If Moscow sent an emergency message, if the message contains time-sensitive instructions, change the dead drop location, suspend contact, evacuate the city, he won't receive those instructions for a week. He makes his second mistake. He decides to call the emergency number. The emergency number exists for exactly this situation, a critical breakdown in communications that requires immediate contact with Moscow. Sokolov has memorized the number since 1949, has never called it, has been trained to use it only in the most extreme circumstances. Arrest is imminent. Your cover is compromised. You are being followed. Or you missed an emergency broadcast during a citywide blackout, and you need to know what Moscow wants. The number routes through a cutout system, several relay points designed to obscure the final destination. Sokolov dials carefully in the dark, listening to the rotary dial click back after each number. The line connects. Rings twice. A man's voice answers in English. Yeah? I need to speak to Peter. The recognition phrase. Peter's not here. Call back tomorrow. It's important. About the apartment we discussed. A pause. Sokolov hears something in the background. Maybe traffic. Maybe other voices. Then the man says, "Hold on." 30 seconds. Sokolov listens to static on the line. Somewhere in the building, someone is singing. He hears the melody faintly through the walls. Something he doesn't recognize. Maybe a folk song. A different voice comes on. Woman, speaking Russian. Identification. Seagull. His current operational code name. Wait for contact at primary location. 48 hours. The line disconnects. Sokolov replaces the receiver. Sits in the darkness. Feels his heartbeat gradually slow. Primary location means the chess tables in Washington Square Park. 48 hours means Thursday at the usual time, 3 p.m. He will meet Peter, receive instructions directly, clarify whatever the emergency broadcast contained. Everything is fine. He followed procedure. He used the emergency number correctly. He will receive his instructions on Thursday. He doesn't know that the call he just made was traced to a phone booth at the corner of 8th Avenue and West 23rd Street in exactly 97 seconds. Fast enough that FBI technical surveillance teams monitoring Soviet communications traffic can triangulate the originating call to a geographic area of approximately 30 square blocks in Greenwich Village. And he doesn't know that when the lights come back on at 11:27 p.m., power restored in cascading waves across the grid, FBI counterintelligence specialists in Federal Plaza will begin the systematic process of identifying every Soviet bloc immigrant, every person with language skills relevant to technical intelligence, every individual with access to classified defense information, living in that 30 square block area. It takes them less than 19 hours to generate a list of 47 names. Alexander Sokolov's name is 17th on the list. The FBI's Soviet division operates from the 28th floor of the Federal Building at 26 Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan. In November 1965, the division chief is Special Agent James Devine, 49 years old, 22 years with the Bureau, a specialist in Soviet counterintelligence who spent 4 years in the FBI's Moscow embassy posting learning how KGB illegals think and operate. Devine has a reputation for patience. He runs investigations that last years, watching suspects, documenting patterns, building cases that will hold up in court. He doesn't rush. He doesn't guess. But the call traced to Greenwich Village during the blackout gives him something he's never had before. Time-stamped evidence that a Soviet illegal tried to contact a handler during an emergency. The trace itself is the result of a technical surveillance program that Divine has been running since 1962, a collaboration with AT&T's security division that monitors calls to and from specific telephone numbers associated with suspected Soviet intelligence activity. The system doesn't record the calls. Federal law prohibits warrantless wiretapping of U.S. citizens, but it does record the phone numbers involved, the time and duration of each call, and the geographic origin of the call based on the switching equipment used to route it. When the blackout hits, AT&T's switching system runs on battery backup power for approximately 90 minutes before the diesel generators at major switching centers come online. During that 90-minute window, most New Yorkers cannot make phone calls. The switching equipment is overloaded, circuits are jammed with people trying to call family members, and the battery backup provides only minimal functionality. But sophisticated telecommunications equipment, the kind used by businesses, hospitals, and surveillance systems, includes priority routing that ensures critical calls connect even when the network is saturated. The FBI's monitoring system has this priority routing, so when someone calls one of the flagged numbers during the blackout, the system traces the call and records the data even though thousands of other calls are failing to connect. The number Sokolov called is flagged because the FBI traced it 3 years earlier to a phone booth in Alphabet City that a known KGB officer used twice in 1962. The officer, traveling under diplomatic cover as an attaché to the Soviet UN mission, was expelled from the United States in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis as part of a general expulsion of suspected intelligence officers. But his contact numbers remained in the FBI's monitoring system, on the theory that the KGB might still use the cutout infrastructure he established. At 2:14 a.m. on November 10th, while most of Manhattan sleeps through the first quiet night after the blackout, Divine receives a phone call at his apartment on the Upper West Side. The call comes from the Soviet division duty officer, who tells him that the monitoring system flagged a call to a known Soviet cutout number, traced to a 30-square block area in Greenwich Village, made at 9:23 p.m. during the blackout. Divine is at his desk by 3:00 a.m. The monitoring report sits in front of him, 3 pages of technical telecommunications data that includes switching center IDs, call duration, 1 minute and 18 seconds, and the triangulated origin point. He unfolds a street map of Manhattan, marks the area with a red pencil. Roughly bounded by Houston Street to the south, 14th Street to the north, 6th Avenue to the east, Hudson Street to the west. 30 square blocks, approximately 18,000 residents. Divine needs to narrow the search. By 9 a.m., he has a team of 12 agents working the case. Their first task is to identify anyone living in the target area who matches the profile of a potential Soviet illegal. Foreign-born, entered the United States after World War II, has access to sensitive information, or works in a position where they could develop sources with such access, has no verifiable family connections, lives alone, maintains a low profile. The team cross-references census, bureau records, voter registration data, utility customer databases, university employment records, hospital staff directories, publishing house employee lists, think tank rosters. By 6 p.m., they have 47 names. By midnight, they've eliminated 32. Too old, too young, arrived in the United States with verifiable family members, have extensive social networks that would make illegal status virtually impossible to maintain. 15 names remain. Divine looks at the list. 15 people, any of whom might be the illegal who panicked during the blackout and called Moscow. Alexander Sokolov's name stands out. Male, 42, teaches Russian literature at NYU, immigrated from Poland in 1949, lives alone, no known family, modest social life, limited to academic colleagues. The profile fits. But then, so do the other 14 names. Divine needs more information. The FBI cannot surveil all 15 suspects simultaneously. Divine doesn't have the manpower. Effective surveillance requires at least 6 agents per target to maintain coverage without being detected. and he cannot simply arrest all 15 and interrogate them. If he arrests the wrong people, the real illegal will know the FBI is closing in and will either flee or go dormant. Devine needs to narrow the list further. He needs a discriminator, something that distinguishes the real illegal from the innocent immigrants who happen to match the profile. The discriminator is already there, sitting in the FBI's archives, waiting for someone to notice it. In August 1961, a KGB major named Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the CIA in Helsinki. Golitsyn brought with him fragments of information about Soviet intelligence operations in the West, including details about illegals' networks. Most of Golitsyn's information is fragmentary, code names without identities, operational details without locations. But buried in his debriefing transcripts is a reference to an illegal operating in New York with the codename Seagull, assigned to collect intelligence on U.S. aerospace programs. The CIA shared Golitsyn's debriefing transcripts with the FBI in 1962. The FBI filed them, investigated the leads that seemed promising, but never identified Seagull. The investigation eventually went cold. Too many possibilities. Too little specific information. Now, Devine pulls those transcripts from the archives and reads them again. Golitsyn didn't know Seagull's real name or cover identity, but he did know that Seagull was a trained illegal, spoke fluent English, had successfully infiltrated American academic circles by 1960, and was considered a high-value asset by Directorate S academic circles. Devine looks at his list of 15 suspects. 5 work in academic or research positions. 3 of those 5 have backgrounds that could provide access to aerospace intelligence, either directly or through potential sources. One of those 3 is Alexander Sokolov, who teaches at NYU, where the engineering department conducts research funded by Department of Defense contracts, including work on hypersonic reentry vehicles, directly relevant to Project Dinosaur. Devine puts a checkmark next to Sokolov's name. Then he puts check marks next to 2 other names, a research librarian at Columbia University's Engineering Library, and a technical translator at a Manhattan publishing house specializing in scientific texts. 3 suspects. Devine can surveil 3 suspects. He assigns teams to each, effective immediately. The surveillance is comprehensive: physical coverage, photographic documentation, trash retrieval and analysis, monitoring of phone calls from nearby locations using parabolic microphones, and, most importantly, electronic surveillance of their shortwave radio usage. This last component is technically challenging. The FBI cannot monitor what frequency someone listens to on a shortwave receiver unless they can physically access the receiver or install monitoring equipment nearby. But they can detect when someone is operating a receiver, because shortwave receivers emit a faint radio frequency signal called local oscillator radiation, a byproduct of the receiver's internal circuitry. With sensitive equipment positioned close enough to the target's residence, FBI technicians can detect when a shortwave receiver is turned on, what frequency it's tuned to, and how long it remains active. The FBI installs this equipment in vehicles parked near all 3 suspects' residences on November 12th, 2 days after the blackout. The vehicles are disguised as Con Edison repair trucks, still common on the streets, as utility crews complete restoration work following the blackout. On Tuesday evening, November 16th, at exactly 9:00 p.m., the monitoring equipment near Alexander Sokolov's apartment detects a shortwave receiver tuning to 5850 kilohertz. The receiver remains active for 6 minutes, then switches off. The research librarian at Columbia is home that evening, but operates no radio equipment. The technical translator at the publishing house operates a receiver at 8:35 p.m., but tunes to 7440 kilohertz, a frequency used by Radio Sweden, not by Soviet number stations. Devine receives the monitoring report at 10:17 p.m. He sits at his desk, looking at the data, and permits himself a small smile. After 4 years of investigating Soviet illegals in New York, after hundreds of dead ends and cold trails, he finally has a solid lead. But having a lead and building a prosecutable case are different problems. Devine cannot arrest Sokolov based solely on evidence that he owns a shortwave receiver and tunes to a frequency that might be used by Soviet number stations. Millions of Americans own shortwave receivers. Listening to international broadcasts is not a crime. Devine needs evidence of espionage, proof that Sokolov is collecting classified information, proof that he's transmitting that information to Moscow, proof that he's operating as an agent of a foreign power. Devine decides to wait. He maintains surveillance, monitors Sokolov's movements, watches his patterns. He needs Sokolov to lead him to either a source or a courier, preferably both. On Thursday, November 18th at 2:47 p.m., Alexander Sokolov leaves his apartment and walks to Washington Square Park. He arrives at the chess tables at 3:02 p.m. He sits on a bench near the northwest corner, watches two men playing speed chess, appears to be simply enjoying the afternoon. At 3:19 p.m., a man approaches and sits on the same bench, 3 feet away. The man is approximately 50 years old, wearing a dark overcoat and a gray fedora. He does not speak to Sokolov. After 47 seconds, he stands and walks away, leaving a folded newspaper on the bench between them. Sokolov waits 90 seconds. Then he picks up the newspaper, unfolds it as if to read, stands, and walks back toward Grove Street. FBI surveillance teams photographed the entire sequence from 3 different angles. They photograph the man in the gray fedora from 4 different angles as he leaves the park, heading south on McDougal Street. They follow him to a subway station at West 4th Street, where he descends to the platform and boards a southbound F train. The surveillance team loses him in the crowds at the West 4th Street station. The station is too crowded, too many exits, and the team doesn't have enough agents to cover all possible egress points. But they have the photographs, and they have the newspaper retrieved from a trash can where Sokolov discarded it after walking 2 blocks from the park. The newspaper is that day's edition of the New York Times. Inside, folded between the sports section and the business section, is a single sheet of paper with typewritten text. Suspend primary collection. Maintain schedule. Await further instructions. Devine looks at the message in the FBI's photography lab at Federal Plaza. Short, cryptic, but clearly an operational instruction. Combined with the surveillance photographs showing Sokolov receiving the newspaper from an unidentified man, the message provides strong evidence that Sokolov is involved in intelligence activities. But it's still not enough. Suspend primary collection could mean anything. Defense attorneys would argue the message is ambiguous, that it doesn't necessarily prove espionage. Devine needs more. He needs to catch Sokolov in the act of collecting classified information or meeting with a source. The surveillance continues. Days become weeks. Sokolov maintains his routine, teaches classes at NYU, holds office hours, attends department meetings, occasionally visits the library at the university's current Institute of Mathematical Sciences. On Tuesday evenings, the monitoring equipment detects his shortwave receiver tuning to 5850 kHz at 9:01 p.m., remaining active for 5 to 7 minutes. On December 14th, Sokolov breaks his routine. Instead of returning home after his afternoon class, he walks north through Washington Square Park, continues up 5th Avenue to 42nd Street, enters the New York Public Library's main branch. FBI agents follow him inside, watch him proceed to the 3rd floor reading room. He sits at a table, requests several books from the library's collection, titles on Russian literature, consistent with his academic profile. He reads for 90 minutes, taking notes in a small notebook. At 4:47 p.m., he stands, returns the books to the circulation desk, and walks to the men's restroom on the 3rd floor. An FBI agent follows, entering the restroom 20 seconds after Sokolov. The restroom is empty except for Sokolov, who is standing at a sink, washing his hands. The agent enters a stall, waits. Sokolov leaves after 97 seconds. The agent emerges from the stall, checks the restroom carefully. In the tank of the 3rd toilet from the door, wrapped in waterproof plastic and taped to the inside of the tank, is a small metal container about the size of a cigarette case. The agent photographs the container in place, then carefully removes it. Inside the container are 4 strips of 35mm film, each strip containing approximately 20 frames of photographed documents. The agent photographs the film strips, returns the container to its location in the toilet tank, and leaves the restroom. The film strips are processed at the FBI laboratory that evening. The images show technical documents related to Project Dinosaur, engineering drawings of the Delta Wing assembly, heat shield test data, orbital maneuvering calculations. Each page is stamped "Secret" or "Confidential" in the top and bottom margins. Devine now has his evidence. Sokolov used a dead drop in a public library to retrieve classified documents. The documents concern a sensitive military aerospace program. Sokolov is operating as a Soviet intelligence agent. But Devine still doesn't know who is supplying the documents to Sokolov, and he wants that source. He wants to roll up the entire network. Illegal and source, courier and cutout, everyone involved in the operation. He makes a calculated decision. He will allow the operation to continue running while FBI surveillance teams watch every step. He will identify the source, document the entire chain of custody, and then arrest everyone simultaneously. But Devine doesn't account for the fact that Moscow is also watching, and Moscow has noticed something wrong. The KGB Operations Center in Yasenevo receives reports on all illegals networks weekly. The reports are brief: operational status, recent contacts, intelligence product delivered, any concerns or anomalies. For 16 years, the reports on Seagull have been consistently positive. High-value intelligence, regular schedule maintained, no security concerns. The December 1965 report is different. It notes that Seagull used the emergency contact number during the blackout, that he missed the beginning of an emergency broadcast, that he requested direct contact with his courier. Individually, these facts are not alarming. The blackout was an exceptional event, and Seagull's response was arguably reasonable. But taken together, they represent a deviation from established patterns. And deviations concern KGB security officers, whose job is to identify compromised agents before arrests occur. The security review is assigned to Major Valentin Yezhov, a methodical analyst who has worked in Directorate S's security section since 1958. Yezhov examines Seagull's operational history, looking for anomalies. He finds several small ones: a meeting with the courier delayed by 20 minutes in September 1965 because of subway delays, a missed dead drop servicing in July 1965 that was attributed to unusually heavy police presence in Washington Square Park, a brief mention in an October 1965 report that Seagull seemed somewhat anxious during a meeting. Individually, these are minor issues. Collectively, they suggest increasing stress on the agent. Yezhov knows that stress leads to mistakes, and mistakes lead to exposure. He recommends pulling Seagull out of operation, exfiltrating him from the United States, either permanently or temporarily, until a security review can be completed. His recommendation reaches the desk of Colonel Yuri Nosenko on January 4th, 1966. Nosenko reviews the file, considers the recommendation, and faces a difficult decision. Seagull is producing high-value intelligence on Project Dinosaur, intelligence that the Soviet aerospace industry desperately needs as they develop their own manned space program. Pulling Seagull out means losing that intelligence stream, but leaving him in place means risking his capture, which would not only lose the intelligence stream, but also potentially expose other aspects of the illegals' network. Nosenko makes a compromise decision. He will not exfiltrate Seagull immediately, but he will suspend his intelligence collection activities and place him in a dormant status for 6 months. During that time, security officers will conduct covert surveillance to determine if Seagull is under counterintelligence investigation. If no surveillance is detected, Seagull can resume operations. If surveillance is detected, he will be exfiltrated immediately. The message is transmitted to Siegel via number station broadcast on Tuesday, January 11th, 1966. Decoded, it reads, "Cease all operational activity. Maintain cover. Do not contact source. Do not service dead drops. Await further instructions. Acknowledge." Alexander Sokolov receives the message that evening, sitting at his desk in the apartment on Grove Street, writing down the numbers as the mechanical voice reads them over the shortwave receiver. He decodes the message using his one-time pad, reads it twice to make sure he understands it correctly, and feels something cold settle in his chest. Cease all operational activity means Moscow suspects compromise. They're pulling him back, putting him on ice. He has been operating for 16 years without any indication that FBI counterintelligence has noticed him. But now, Moscow thinks something is wrong. He follows the instructions. He does not visit the library dead drop. He does not attempt to contact his source. He maintains his academic routine, teaching classes, attending meetings, publishing a paper on Chekhov's later short stories. To any observer, he is simply Professor Sokolov, living his quiet life devoted to Russian literature. But FBI surveillance teams notice the change. Sokolov stops visiting the library. His routine becomes rigidly consistent, apartment to university to apartment, with no deviations. On Tuesday evenings, he still tunes his shortwave receiver to 5850 kHz, but the monitoring duration drops from 6 minutes to 3 minutes, suggesting shorter messages. James Devine recognizes the pattern. The KGB has put Sokolov into dormant status, probably because they suspect counterintelligence surveillance. Devine faces a choice: arrest Sokolov now, based on the evidence already collected, or wait and hope the KGB eventually reactivates him so the FBI can identify his source. The decision is made for him by events in Moscow. On February 12, 1966, Yuri Nosenko defects to the CIA in Geneva, where he is attending a disarmament conference. Nosenko brings with him detailed information about KGB illegals operations in the United States, including specifics about Siegel's network. The CIA immediately shares this information with the FBI. Devine learns the source's identity on February 14, 1966. The source is Dr. Martin Wheeler, a civilian aerospace engineer working for Boeing on the Dinosaur program, based at the company's facility in Seattle. Wheeler has been passing classified documents to Soviet intelligence since 1959. Motivated partly by ideology, he considers himself a socialist who believes technological knowledge should be shared internationally, and partly by money. The KGB has been paying him $800 per month, deposited in a Swiss bank account. Wheeler travels to New York periodically for meetings at Boeing's Manhattan office. During these visits, he photographs documents from his briefcase using a Minox camera and leaves the film in the library dead drop, where Sokolov retrieves it. On February 16, 1966, FBI agents arrest Dr. Martin Wheeler at his home in Seattle. Simultaneously, agents arrest Alexander Sokolov at his apartment in Greenwich Village. Sokolov is sitting at his desk, grading student papers, when the agents knock on his door at 6:47 a.m. He opens the door, sees the credentials, and says nothing. He doesn't resist. He doesn't ask questions. He simply stands and allows the agents to handcuff him. The FBI searches his apartment, finding the shortwave receiver, the one-time pad hidden in War and Peace, a second one-time pad concealed in a hollowed-out book of Pushkin's poetry, a Minox camera, and approximately $14,000 in cash hidden in a sealed jar in his kitchen cupboard. The search also finds something unexpected: a journal written in Russian containing Sokolov's private thoughts over 16 years of operation. The journal is not encrypted. It's simply his personal record, perhaps something he kept for psychological reasons, perhaps something he intended to eventually smuggle back to Moscow as a memoir of his service. The journal entries are revealing. They describe the loneliness of illegal work, the psychological strain of maintaining a false identity for years, the constant fear of exposure. One entry, dated November 12, 1965, describes the blackout and his decision to call the emergency number. I panicked. I should not have called. I know the protocols. But in the darkness, with the city silent, I felt suddenly exposed, as if everyone could see what I really am. I called because I needed to hear a voice that knew the truth. I think I have made a terrible mistake. He was right. The trial of United States versus Alexander Sokolov and Martin Wheeler begins on September 12, 1966, in federal court in Manhattan. Sokolov is charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized possession of defense information, and acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign government. Wheeler faces similar charges, plus additional counts related to his mishandling of classified documents. Wheeler pleads guilty in exchange for a 20-year sentence. He testifies against Sokolov, describing their dead drop system, confirming that Sokolov was the recipient of the photographed documents, explaining that he knew Sokolov was passing the documents to Soviet intelligence. Sokolov's defense attorney argues that the FBI's evidence is based on unconstitutional surveillance, that the monitoring of Sokolov's shortwave receiver violated his Fourth Amendment rights, that the FBI had no warrant to monitor his radio usage. It's a technically sophisticated argument, legally novel, and ultimately unsuccessful. The judge rules that monitoring radio frequency emissions from a receiver does not constitute a search under the Fourth Amendment, because those emissions are technically public radio signals that anyone with appropriate equipment could detect. Sokolov is convicted on all counts on November 3, 1966, exactly 1 year and 6 days after the blackout. He is sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. He serves 18 years, maintaining his silence throughout his incarceration, refusing all interview requests, never providing any information about other Soviet intelligence operations. He is released in 1984 as part of a prisoner exchange, traded for 2 CIA officers captured in East Germany. He returns to the Soviet Union and disappears from public record. Martin Wheeler serves his full 20-year sentence and is released in 1986. He dies in 1994 in Seattle, largely forgotten. The courier who met Sokolov in Washington Square Park is never identified. The FBI shows Sokolov photographs of known KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover, but he refuses to identify anyone. The man in the gray fedora remains unknown, presumably either exfiltrated by the KGB after Sokolov's arrest, or still operating under deep cover as of 1966. The case is classified secret until 1991, when documents are partially declassified following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Researchers piecing together Cold War intelligence operations noticed the case in 2003, when a historian named Dr. Sarah Chen, working through FBI files at the National Archives, discovers the connection between the Great Blackout and Sokolov's exposure. Chen publishes her findings in 2004 in the journal Intelligence and National Security, in an article titled Accidental Exposure: How Infrastructure Failure Revealed Soviet Espionage in 1965. The article receives limited academic attention, but is largely ignored by mainstream historians, who focus on more dramatic espionage cases like Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen. But Chen's article reveals something important about the nature of Cold War intelligence operations: that sometimes the most sophisticated spy networks are undone not by brilliant counterintelligence work, but by accidents, by infrastructure failures, by moments of human panic when the lights go out, and an illegal operative sitting alone in the darkness makes the understandable but fatal decision to reach for a telephone. The irony is that the Great Blackout itself, the event that triggered Sokolov's exposure, was caused by a maintenance error, a simple mechanical relay set to the wrong threshold. If relay Q29BD at the Beck generating station had been properly calibrated, if that single small component among thousands in the interconnected power grid had functioned correctly, 30 million people would not have experienced a blackout. Alexander Sokolov would not have panicked and called the emergency number, and Siegel's network might have continued operating for years. Intelligence agencies learn from the Sokolov case. The KGB revises its emergency contact protocols, establishing more robust procedures for illegals to follow during infrastructure failures or other unexpected events. The FBI enhances its technical surveillance capabilities, developing better equipment for monitoring radio frequency emissions and establishing legal frameworks for using such monitoring in counterintelligence investigations. But the deeper lesson, the one that appears repeatedly throughout the history of espionage, is that human psychology remains the most unpredictable variable in intelligence operations. You can train agents for years, drill them in protocols, prepare them for every contingency, but you cannot completely eliminate the psychological stress of living a double life, and you cannot predict how any individual will respond when events spiral beyond their control. Sokolov survived 16 years as an illegal, maintaining perfect operational security, following protocols, never making a suspicious move. But 90 minutes into a citywide blackout, sitting in the darkness, unable to decode an emergency message, he made one phone call. One call lasting 78 seconds, traced to a 30-square block area in Greenwich Village. And that single call, made in a moment of stress during an event that had nothing to do with espionage or intelligence or the Cold War, unraveled everything. The National Archives at College Park, Maryland, houses the declassified FBI files on the Sokolov case in Box 847, Record Group 65, Section 105. The box contains 2,147 pages of documents, surveillance logs, photographs, technical reports, transcripts of telephone intercepts, laboratory analysis of the one-time pads, translations of Sokolov's journal entries, trial transcripts. Buried in the middle of the box, on page 1031, is a single photograph taken by an FBI surveillance team on November 18, 1965. The photograph shows Alexander Sokolov sitting on a bench in Washington Square Park, a folded newspaper beside him, looking at two men playing chess. The photograph is black and white, slightly grainy, shot with a telephoto lens from approximately 80 feet away. Sokolov's face is visible in profile. He looks tired. His coat is buttoned against the November cold. In his hand, barely visible in the photograph, is a watch, a Soviet-made Poljot watch with a stainless steel band, the kind issued to KGB officers as a service award after 10 years of successful operations. The watch shows 3:19 p.m. In exactly 47 seconds, the courier will arrive, leave the newspaper, and disappear into the crowd. In exactly 3 weeks, FBI technicians will install monitoring equipment that will detect Sokolov's shortwave receiver and begin the surveillance that will lead to his arrest. But in the photograph, none of that has happened yet. In the photograph, Sokolov is still Professor Alexander Sokolov, teacher of Russian literature, devoted to Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, living a quiet life in Greenwich Village. The watch on his wrist, marking time in that frozen moment, is the only indication that he is anything other than what he appears to be. The watch was entered into evidence at his trial as Government Exhibit 47C. After the trial, it was returned to FBI storage, where it presumably remains in a property room somewhere, a small piece of metal and glass, still keeping time, though no one winds it anymore. In the history of the Cold War, the Great Blackout of 1965 is remembered as an infrastructure failure, a cautionary tale about the fragility of interconnected systems. The relay at the Beck generating station that failed has been preserved as a teaching artifact, displayed in the Control Room Museum at the Sir Adam Beck Station in Queenston, Ontario. Tour guides tell visitors about cascade failures and grid stability. Engineers study the blackout as a seminal event in power systems reliability. None of the tour guides mention Alexander Sokolov. None of the engineering textbooks reference Seagull or Project Dinosaur or the dead drop in the New York Public Library. The connection between the blackout and the spy network exists only in declassified FBI files and in Sarah Chen's obscure academic article, read by perhaps 300 historians and intelligence researchers. But in the broader story of Cold War espionage, the Sokolov case poses a question that remains relevant. How many other intelligence operations, successful or failed, were influenced by accidents, by infrastructure failures, by random events that had nothing to do with the carefully planned chess game between CIA and KGB? How many agents were exposed because of a blackout, a traffic jam, a telephone line that failed at the wrong moment? How many operations succeeded because of similar accidents that broke in the opposite direction? The archives don't answer these questions. The files contain what they contain, surveillance logs and photographs and transcripts, but they cannot capture the counterfactual histories. The operations that almost succeeded or almost failed based on events no one could predict or control. What the files do show is this. On November 9th, 1965, at 5:28 p.m., a relay failed at a generating station in Ontario. 93 minutes later, a Soviet illegal named Alexander Sokolov, sitting in the darkness in an apartment in Greenwich Village, made a decision. And that decision, prompted by an electrical failure, by the simple human need to know what was happening, ended an intelligence operation that had run successfully for 16 years. Sometimes history turns on great strategic decisions, on carefully planned operations, on the brilliant work of intelligence officers. And sometimes it turns on a relay set to the wrong threshold, on a phone call made in the darkness, on a watch that marks time while the lights are out, and 30 million people wait for them to come back on. Unaware that in a small apartment on Grove Street, something far more significant than the blackout is unfolding. Something that will remain secret for 39 years, until a historian finds a file in an archive and pieces together the story of how darkness revealed everything.